Thanks. Welcome to the Wednesday, July 12th, 2023 meeting of the Redmond Planning Commission. Call this meeting to order. And we'll start with a roll call of the commission. Commissioner Aparna.
Present.
Commissioner Van Nyman.
Present.
Commissioner Nueva Camina.
Present.
Commissioner Woodyear.
Present.
Vice Chair Weston.
Present.
And I am Chair Nichols, Sherry Nichols, and Commissioner Denny Sheffrin is excused tonight. We also have, extending their workday and joining us tonight, staff members Chris Wyatt, Jeff Churchill, Lauren Alpert, Ian Lefcourt, Becky Fry, Carolyn Chapman, and Glenn Coyle. I look for a motion to approve the agenda tonight.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And the agenda is approved. We also have meeting minutes and a meeting summary, the June 14th, 2023 meeting minutes and June 28th, 2023 meeting summary that we need a motion to approve.
So moved for both.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And those are approved. This is the point in the meeting in which we provide opportunity for public comment on any item that is not the subject of a public hearing. You can come to the mic and speak to us about any item that's not the public hearing for about 3 minutes. Ian, do you want to run the?
Absolutely, and we have a list. Some folks are here to provide comment specifically for the center's public hearing, and some are not. So I'm going to go through the folks who are identified that they are not, so that they can go on with their day. So let's start with David Morton.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. I'm David Morton. I live on Northeast Union Hill Road in Redmond 98053. On July 25th, 2022, I asked the Planning Commission to please reject the idea of an industrial center in Southeast Redmond, which is located entirely on Redmond's critical aquifer recharge areas, or CARAs. I currently do not oppose the idea of an industrial district in Southeast Redmond. However, I do oppose locating any sources of potential groundwater contamination on Redmond's CARAs. Redmond's zoning code regarding prohibited land uses and activities in critical aquifer recharge areas 1 and 2 contains an error which still appears in the current code. In that subsection of code, 25 land uses and activities are prohibited in CARA 1, but only 2 such land uses and activities are prohibited in CARA 2. It's been suggested that this was a scrivener's error and that the 25 prohibited land uses and activities will apply to both CARAs 1 and 2 in the rewrite of Redmond's zoning code. It was particularly alarming to see that One Redmond and the City of Redmond invited business owners and leaders to a March 28, 2023 breakfast at which a handout was distributed. A photo of that handout is attached to that email as a PDF. The handout indicates that the following land uses are allowed in the Southeast Redmond Industrial Growth Center: hazardous waste treatment and storage, solid waste transfer and recycling, mining and extraction, and automobile repair. These land uses have been identified by the EPA as potential sources of groundwater contamination. So it was disturbing to see that Redmond's zoning code currently allows such land uses in CARA 2, and that One Redmond seemed to be inviting businesses to locate such operations on Redmond's drinking water aquifer. on the condition that the error in Redmond's zoning code is corrected and that sufficient attention is paid to potential sources of groundwater contamination, I will withdraw my request to reject the idea of an industrial center in southeast Redmond. In fact, I applaud Microsoft for planning a large new EV charging facility in the southeast Redmond Industrial Growth Center at the site where Olympian Precast was located. However, that site has confirmed and suspected petroleum contamination of soil, groundwater, and surface water since 1991 and will hopefully be cleaned up before the Microsoft facility goes in. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Next, we have Scott Kapperman.
Hello, my name's Scott Koppelman. Koppelman. I'm with Amley Residential. We are owners, developers, and long-term holders of market-rate apartment communities, and we also include affordable housing units within our projects when we are developing in the city of Redmond. We have one project that we hope to break ground on in a couple of months in downtown Redmond, and we are also pursuing other opportunities to develop housing in Redmond. And I'm here to speak about Attachment C to the housing element, and that contains some proposed regulatory amendments. I've got a number of concerns, broad concerns about a number of components within Attachment C. There are others here to speak about a number of issues that they have within the Overlake, the proposed amendments that would govern Overlake. I'm going to focus on the parking allowance provision, and that's on page 42 of, of Attachment C. I'm opposed to the concept of a parking allowance altogether, but I'll focus specifically on the draft language. And if you hone in on that draft language, I really think there's a disconnect between the proposed code amendment, which effectively disincentivizes the construction of parking, and the other provisions of the land use code, which prescribe code minimums for parking. So I think, again, there's a disconnect there. Maybe a bigger issue is that I think the parking allowance is really a parking allowance in name only. As you can see from the language, there are no limitations on how that parking allowance can be used. It's a cash payment and can be used in any way the affordable housing renter chooses. So again, it comes across as a parking allowance in name only. And it also is drafted, an affordable housing renter without a car would be treated differently than a affordable housing renter with a car. Both would receive the subsidy, but one would receive a greater benefit towards their total rent. Housing versus housing plus parking, the same subsidy. There's a disconnect there. It's not equitable in how each renter is treated, one with a car, one without. And I do think the cash payment concept that's in the current draft would create potentially cash flow issues for the affordable housing renter. They would have to come out of pocket to pay for that parking space and then wait until that subsidy is received. Two suggestions, and I'll get to those here quickly. Again, I'm not supportive of a parking allowance at all. These parking spaces are extremely expensive to build. But if the Planning Commission is inclined to consider a parking allowance, I would suggest a couple of revisions to the draft language. Number one is to limit the use of the parking allowance only for the purpose of paying for a parking space within the project that renter lives. This just makes sense in our view. If it's a parking allowance, it should be used for parking. And then to replace the cash payment concept with a credit concept to avoid the situation where an affordable housing renter would have to come out of pocket for the full cost of parking and then wait until a cash subsidy is received. That's it. That's all I have to say. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
We also have Deba Wegner, but did you want to do the center's public hearing or an items from the audience?
That's me here. I'm actually just here as an observer. I'm not speaking. So I signed in, but I didn't realize it was to speak.
That's, thank you for attending. Okay, let's do Steve Yoon.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Steve Yoon. I represent Mill Creek Residential Trust. We're a multifamily developer. We own 3 projects in Redmond with many residents, hopefully happy residents. I'm here today to voice some concerns regarding, and they're more philosophical in nature, regarding the housing and affordability initiatives. And specifically, my concern is that, you know, the financial feasibility is a really big deal now, and I want the Planning Commission to understand that in today's environment, values have gone down 20%. Costs have not gone down. Costs are going up, and a lot of that's because of new requirements put in. And so I am concerned that putting more burden on the development and the financing is going to make infeasible projects, you know, more infeasible, which means less supply is being built, which means that the whole reason why we're trying to get to affordable housing will work the other way, and it will result in more expensive housing and less options. So I am very, very concerned, and I'd like the Planning Commission to really ask themselves, you know, does this incentivize housing or does it disincentivize housing in light of where we're at right now? I think it's very, very important we all ask that question, and I ask that in any forum where this legislation is considered, that we really, really evaluate that, because I think we all don't want a situation where projects don't get built. I also want to point out a couple other things. There's no, because some of these impacts are very significant, there's no proposed relief for those who have started the projects and, you know, have utilized the existing rules, you know, to do their development, and now rules are changing. So I do recommend and support, and I believe a lot of members of the development community also support a grace period. Those who have already started the projects should, you know, be allowed some relief from the new rules, and that's for both the overlake and the housing. I strongly believe that, especially because of the burdens that are introduced here. I also want to be, you know, clear. Obviously, MFT is a separate issue, but I've been here before, and I want to restate that that is the mechanism for a win-win. And right now, you know, again, the way this is set up is the 100% of the burden for affordable development falls on the development. There's no help or relief or, hey, we can, you know, in various other, you know, meetings we've discussed even bike parking being reduced to offset the cost of parking. Their MFT should promote new development, so that, you know, should be weaved in at some point. I strongly believe that. As for the inclusionary housing, I just want to give this group an example related to what's been shown here on the 10% of units going from 80% to 50%, just to give you guys some rough numbers. On a 200-unit project, that would be 20 affordable units. The rent delta is $879 for the renter. When you extrapolate that to, you know, each unit, 12 months, you know, annual, and a quote-unquote burden to the development, it's $222,000 per affordable unit, a burden put on the development for that one item. When you look at the development as a whole for the 20 units, that's $4.4 million. So it is a very significant item, and I already said, look, values have gone down 20%. And so, and already projects are not being financed right now. It just is what it is. And this would just destroy things, to be honest with you. And developments would not happen because they're already not happening now. And, maybe a year or two ago when things were really good, this was, maybe there could have been some wiggle room, but it's just really hard. I just got to be upfront. Related to parking, I share Scott's concerns. There is parking unbundling in other jurisdictions. Shoreline is one of them, so I highly recommend an unbundled solution. Related to if it does go down the path of allowance, there's no reference to a specific allowance amount. That needs to be defined for people in the community, whether it's 80%, 90%, 70%, 60%, and there's a impact and the burden associated with that. So I highly recommend that. I mentioned bike parking. I think a reduction there would offset whatever burden is associated with parking. That's my opinion. I think they should be used to sort of cancel things out if we have to go down the path of an allowance, situation. So, and then, similar to what I mentioned before, projects that have already started or in the process, just some grace period relief for those who have started and, have to inherit this. So I guess just big picture, I'm asking the Planning Commission to take a step back and to think, do these rules incentivize development? Do they promote and we'll get to affordable housing in today's market? And I think it's really hard, but I asked the Planning Commission in the city of Redmond to really assess that. Thank you. I'm also here to Lindley Woolston from Alliance Residential gave me some comments. I'm just going to read it verbatim. And this is regarding parking and affordable housing as well. So, quote, including parking and rent is not an appropriate or beneficial approach for many reasons. The focus of affordable housing should be on providing safe, decent, and cost-effective shelter rather than subsidizing vehicle ownership. In an era of environmental awareness, we should be encouraging other modes of transportation like walking, cycling, and public transit. Including parking and rent undermines sustainability goals set forth by the city and sends a message that car ownership is essential. Further, forcing residents to subsidize parking spaces they do not use reduces their disposable income and increases costs for all residents. At the very least, when an affordable housing resident does not need a space, it should be reallocated to non-affordable units. The primary objective of affordable housing is to provide low-cost housing options. Parking is not a housing cost and should not be included in the rent calculation. It is an ancillary service that provides convenience to those who own cars and is not a basic housing necessity like shelter, utilities, etc. It's a discretionary amenity that not all residents need or use, and therefore we disagree with including parking and rent calculations, end quote. Lindley Woolston, Development Director at Alliance Residential. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Clayton Graham.
Good evening. Appreciate the commission having me back to comment on the latest iteration of the Overlake regulations. My name's Clayton Graham. I'm a land use attorney at Davis Wright Tremaine. We have offices in Seattle and Bellevue, and we do work in Redmond for various types of developers, including housing developers. It's thrilled to see several developers here tonight speaking for themselves, which is great. And I'm here to offer some comments for a couple clients who were not able to make the meeting. So I'll highlight three major concerns in the latest proposed Overlake zoning regulations. And I think they kind of fall into some of the feasibility concerns that Mr. Yoon was addressing a couple minutes ago. I think the general takeaway here is what the city wants isn't necessarily what the market will bear when it comes to design features, affordable housing levels, parking, and density. So the first of the major concerns here would be the proposal to expand the affordable housing requirements. We don't really understand why the Overlake Metro Center would be singled out to bear a greater burden than other zones of the city, but that would be the result of the adoption of the current iteration of the ordinance. The expanded affordable housing requirements will have a major impact on project pro formas, including at least one project that a client has in the planning stage now. So while we agree that affordable housing is very important and critical for the city, expanding the requirement in one zone only would make some potential projects not pencil out, and at best it would slow development of housing consistent with the city's goals. So I'd urge the commission to seriously consider keeping the affordable housing requirements the same in this zone as in other areas of the city. The second area of concern would be the mixed use requirements. We understand and agree with the city's general preference for active pedestrian ground level development, but that doesn't mean it should be required everywhere. There are some back streets, for example, in the Overlake area where the traffic volume just would not support ground level retail. We've seen these requirements lead to vacant ground level retail in other cities where it was required. So, and of course, vacant retail is a lot less activating than just having residential amenity areas or more apartment uses at ground level. So we just asked the commission to consider focusing the mixed use requirements, if you adopt them, on just key streets where the traffic volumes can support it. The third and final issue that I wanted to raise with the commission is the 70% density requirement in the master plan requirement. We think it's a mistake to require projects to prove that they can hit 70% of the density under allowed zoning. This requirement will generally just stop development in Overlake until high-rise construction is financially feasible. And, you know, the experts in the room, nor the commission, nor I can tell anybody when that's going to happen. So there's no way of telling when those developments will actually be built. So we think it'll have the effect of slowing or stopping development. You know, there are examples like South Lake Union in Seattle where high-rise development was permitted, but mid-rise was built because that's what the market could bear at the time. And if you go through those neighborhoods today, that you'll see that it's led to a pretty good diversity of building types and a successful neighborhood in South Lake Union, and other areas have had similar experiences as well. So if the city wants high-rise development, the city should incentivize that development, but requiring it everywhere, we think, again, would be a mistake. And I'd also just add that the language proposed for the 70% master planning requirement is quite vague. It doesn't say what kind of density is targeted, and we think that it would be unworkable unless it were better defined. So again, we just respectfully, ask the Planning Commission to remove that requirement from the draft ordinance. That's all I had for the commission tonight, and again, we appreciate the opportunity to comment on these matters.
Thank you.
Katie Kendall, do you?
Good evening. Ian, I'm going to speak on both the center's policy and the public hearing and the just general comment. So I'm just going to do the general comment now, and then when the public hearing's open. Okay. I didn't know if my note made any sense there. Sorry. All right. Good evening. My name is Katie Kendall, and I'm with McCullough Hill. I'm speaking on behalf of a number of clients that develop housing in Redmond. Others are speaking to some specifics tonight, but I wanted to just generally discuss some of the Overlake regulations. One thing, from a process standpoint, it's extraordinarily difficult to review these regulations and how they will affect development with the slow drip of information. And I totally understand the breadth of what we're reviewing and how we have to break it up. But there are certain key documents that really help inform what we're talking about today, like the supplemental draft EIS with the new preferred growth alternative, which has not been published yet. The economic data and analysis regarding incentive zoning, or just the zoning regulations in general to make sure that they work. Information on incentive zoning regulations, which I know is coming next. information on MFTE program, which has been crucial in making the city's current inclusionary housing program work, and any of the other requirements such as deeper green building design guidelines that we may see in the future. For example, the centers policy, which we'll speak to later, provides a mandate that design guidelines include requirements that buildings use energy efficient and water efficient, low carbon green building technology. Great goal. But without knowing what those design guidelines are actually saying, how do we actually know how that cost gets balanced with the affordable housing that we're discussing somewhere else? And that's been the difficulty here, is that this all has to be balanced. We can't just say we want the best of this and the best of that and make it work. It just doesn't work, and you're hearing that from the developers right now. One item might be palatable and achievable on its own, but when you combine it with other significant requirements and all the other utility dedications and improvements, it becomes unworkable. And we all need to work together to make sure that development works for everyone here. And then quickly, I do want to address two items in the overlake regulations. I echo everything Clayton said on the master planning requirements, so I'm not going to speak to that again. And the second is the need for a grace period or an opt-out provision for the projects that are currently in process. We have projects that are, at the tail end of approvals, and if these regulations come into play without being able to be vested prior to that, they basically have to start all over. And I don't think anybody wants that. It will certainly chill that development or lead to no development at all there. I really encourage the Planning Commission to think about these regulations and how they could potentially impact the economic viability here, because we do not want to create a de facto moratorium on housing. Nobody wants that here, and I don't think that's anyone's intent. So we need to be very careful on and conscious of that concern as we work through these regulations. Thank you very much, and I'll speak with you in a few minutes.
Thank you, Katie.
Jesse Clausen.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, Planning Commissioners. Jesse Clausen, McCullough Hill. I'm going to ditto everything that Katie and Steve and Scott and Clayton said. I want to call something out because I'm not sure this has been shared with you. Currently, Redmond on the east side is the most successful city at providing affordable housing that has been created by developers at 10% at 80% AMI. I think the numbers are something in the 800 something units have been created by developers that are affordable to people at 80% AMI. It is the most successful program on the east side and it is touted by Bellevue and Kirkland and all of these other places as, wow, look what Redmond's doing. They're doing a great job with affordable housing. So I'm wondering, particularly in this economic environment, why we are changing or why we're proposing to change the requirement such that you hear the hit on the economics of a project that Steve talked about. We're not kidding, and we wouldn't all be here spending time on a lovely summer evening when we say that it's a significant risk that these requirements, particularly as they're put together, will result in projects not working. So we hope that you are listening, and I know that you are. You're all looking at me, and we've worked together before. But we encourage staff and the Planning Commissioner to really work with the development community on this. These are actually your affordable housing providers. These are the people who are building housing for market rate folks, for folks at 80% and folks lower than that. And so if you work with them and you listen to them, they will tell you how to incentivize the development that you're looking for in Overlake. And I don't think any of us want this de facto moratorium that I think if everything was adopted as it's drafted today, that's what you would see. So please work with everybody. On the MFTE parking items, I want to reiterate what everybody said again. I think it's really crucial to look at it. If there is going to be a parking subsidy, it really needs to be for people who are choosing to park in the building. Just giving people a subsidy, even though they're not parking in the building, it's no longer tied to parking, and it's really just a rent reduction disguised as a parking subsidy. And we don't think that that's the intent, but that's how it is currently drafted. So thank you.
Thank you.
And then we have one remote.
Okay.
And this is Mr. Williams.
Hey, this is Jameis.
Hello. You're on with the Planning Commission, and you have about 3 minutes or so to tell us what's on your mind.
Okay. My name is Jameis William. I'm Managing Director with Redmond Partners. And we own the property at the northeast corner of 24th and 152nd. Sorry, you caught me out for a walk. And we've been in an entitlement process for about, and we've been, if this code change goes through, it'll be about the third code change that we've experienced. And we called in previously to express our concerns about some of the changes to the code. In particular, the fact that if this code changes, that if our development agreement hasn't been approved and we're not vested, then the third phase of our project that we haven't submitted an SPE on yet, but is subject to a master plan and a development agreement, could be in jeopardy, meaning we'd have to go back to the drawing board again. And it's our hope that the city will and the Planning Commission will take into account the fact that this could be a real problem for us. And we had called in and commented at prior Planning Commission meetings, and there were discussions with staff about there being an option for projects that have already been submitted to opt into code changes. And we would just request that you take that into consideration tonight as you're looking at making yet another change that would impact our project and potentially render the third phase of our project infeasible based on the changes. We're proposing close to 1,200 units, and about 400 of those would be in jeopardy if that flexibility isn't granted. So hope you can take that into consideration as you're talking through the changes tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's everybody.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Now we will move on to Redmond 2050 Parks, Arts, Recreation, Culture, and Conservation Element and Park Plan and Economic Vitality Element Report Approval. So you've got the draft PC report. We made a recommendation on this at our last meeting. So we just need a motion to approve the draft report.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. And the draft report is approved. Carolyn, did you want to say anything about this?
Oh, just thank you very much for your attention to this process and your feedback. And I know you guys spent a fair amount of time in the review of it, so really appreciate all the time and care that you took with it.
Few details there. Thanks, Carol. Okay, now we move on to Redmond 2050 Centers element, and we will have a public hearing. Becky Fry is going to start us off.
Thank you, Commissioners. I am going to just share my screen really quick. I don't have a presentation, but we'll just share the documents and walk through them. So the centers element before you for public hearing tonight is a revision to the urban centers chapter of the existing comprehensive plan. It consists of an introduction section and 3 components: 1, common centers policies, downtown neighborhood policies, and overlay policies. What we're looking at today and what's going to public hearing does not include any updates to the downtown neighborhood policies. The red line versions in your packet does include them because as an adoption piece, they will still be there, but the downtown policies will be updated as a part of Redmond 2050 Phase 2. They are not included in today's public hearing. So the updates to this chapter include an updated to the introduction. They include the new regional definitions for centers and regional definitions for transit-oriented development and equitable transit-oriented development. And then what we have done is we have set the stage for, in the future, pulling over Marymore, but that will also happen into Phase 2. But we're trying to streamline the common centers policies. So a lot of the things that is being removed from Overlake, removed from Marymore, removed from downtown will be consolidated with these general common policies. And you will have a lot of framework policies for each of these, and then we'll get into the Overlake policies. So what we have done, we have continued to update our policy guide. This is provided to show what has changed from the previous edits. What I have done for this evening is shown where we have made edits based off of our conversation at the last Planning Commission meeting as a proposed edit to the versions that went to public hearing for this evening. So the Planning Commission asked us to make just a couple of very minor edits, so they are shown in here. There's not very many. You can see that there's not a lot of red lines in here. There's a couple of just cleaning up bits and pieces. So I'd be happy to walk through anything in specific, but this is available for everyone this evening. Also, we will be starting this evening a Planning Commission issues matrix for this topic. Again, the purpose of the update for the urban centers element was to update the vision and policies for Redmond centers and Overlake in particular. It reflects the new regional planning policies and requirements, the new centers designations, transit-oriented development, and integrating Redmond 2050 themes of equity and inclusion, sustainability, and resiliency, along with a lot of streamlining to make this chapter less than half the size it is currently. I am happy to answer any questions, or you may open the public hearing at your discretion.
Thanks, Becky. Do we have any questions before? Okay, Commissioner Parna.
Thanks, Becky. I see that some of the changes that I had requested about the water conservation being added to, OV11 has been added, but it's not in the policy guide. It's in the other 2 documents. Just wanted to, and also there's a typo, cooling and heating is not heating, it's hearing right now. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'll make a note of those edits. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions before we start the public hearing? Then I will open the public hearing.
First up, we have Christina Hudson.
Pull this one down. Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Christina Hudson. I am CEO of One Redmond, and we are located down the street in the Opportunity Building. As many of you may know, One Redmond is a public-private partnership and an organization focused on economic development in Redmond. We are Redmond's combined Chamber of Commerce, Community Foundation, and Economic Development Enterprise. And today, I am speaking here on behalf of the Chamber side of our organization. First, I would like to express our thanks to the City Long Range Planning Team for including thoughtful economic vitality section within its Redmond 2050 plan and to convey feedback on behalf of the Redmond business community. We applaud and support the 24 policies developed for sustainable and resilient economy, quality of life, and of course, business and job diversity. Since its inception, One Redmond has advocated for more downtown employment, housing, and amenities to create a vibrant and walkable community convenient to transit options. As the dedicated Chamber of Commerce and representatives of small businesses, nonprofits, and larger businesses within the city of Redmond, we realize the value of balanced growth allocations between Overlake and downtown. We encourage sufficient zoning capacity for growth in downtown Redmond. We believe growth should not be constrained to the projections in the Redmond 2050 plan, which anticipate downtown will experience 27% housing growth, but only 18% of job growth. Existing businesses in the downtown area need to be supported, and we should encourage new business formation by creating a daytime customer base for these restaurants and retail. This increase in density of residential and office is key to our small businesses and their resiliency. We also realize the value of creating that environment where people can live and work within walking distance and not need a car, or have immediate walkable access to mass transit, thereby reducing reliance on vehicle transportation. Again, thank you to the city staff who have worked hard on this plan, ensuring the opportunity to provide input through all avenues to the Redmond community. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Tom Markle.
Good evening. I am Tom Markle. I am with the Nelson Legacy Group here in Redmond. We've been a Redmond business since 1952. Our address is 16508 Northeast 79th Street. I'm also chair of the Government Affairs Committee of One Redmond. I'm here, and I'm going to echo some of what Christina said, to express our concerns regarding Centers Policy UC2, which includes in it a table which shows you the new preferred growth alternative for Redmond. We feel that there's a significant underallocation of job growth to the downtown, and that this allocation should be increased to provide at least 10,000 new jobs in downtown Redmond. UC2 places only 5,900 new jobs, or 18%, in the downtown, while Overlake receives 15,000, or 46%. And downtown even does worse than elsewhere in Redmond. Elsewhere receives 7,000 new jobs, or 22%. Overlake is already greatly out of balance with a lot more jobs than housing. The opposite is true downtown. We have a tremendous amount of housing, but very few jobs. The current allocation, which is job-heavy to Overlake and housing light, and housing-heavy to downtown and job light, really just exacerbates this tremendous imbalance of housing versus jobs. We believe that increasing the number of jobs allocated to downtown Redmond is important for several reasons. First, it is an element of the city's environmental sustainability plan. The Redmond City Council has endorsed the concept of walkable communities, 10-minute communities, where residents can walk to shop, but also walk to work from their apartments. The current codes preclude office development downtown. So as a consequence, downtown's large and already growing population is forced to get into a car to get to their jobs. Second, as Christina pointed out, increasing downtown employment is really good for the small business community, which has been struggling in Redmond. It creates a daytime customer base, and more customers are a good thing for small businesses. Third, it will help attract the new employers that Redmond seeks to have establish a presence here. Surveys show that knowledge-based businesses want to locate in cities where their employees want to live. This makes hiring and retention a lot easier for them. And the kind of employees they want to hire, they would like to live in walkable urban environments where they can walk from their apartment to shop and to go to work and not have to get on transit or drive a car. Fourth, it will take advantage of the investments this city, substantial investments this city and Sound Transit have already made to facilitate growth in downtown Redmond. We're getting a new light rail station. We've built a new Central Park. We've actually constructed the Redmond Central Connector on the old BNSF right-of-way. We've re-engineered our stormwater system, and we've re-engineered the Cleveland and the Redmond Way streets to accommodate growth and more traffic. We have the infrastructure to support more employment as well as housing downtown. And finally, supporting small business by putting more jobs downtown will also create a great environment to create new small businesses downtown. That'll create a more vibrant and interesting downtown, which benefits everyone who lives in Redmond, no matter what neighborhood they live in, whether it's downtown or in Education Hill. The comprehensive plan and the growth allocations inform not only the building codes, but also the development community. Codes are written to accommodate growth goals. Yes, the market will determine where growth occurs, but larger growth allocations will support the opportunity for more downtown employment because it will determine how big an area will support higher densities and more development. Small growth numbers will act as a constraint. And the growth allocation also sends an important signal to the development community about where they should plan their growth. So we ask you to please ask staff to allocate at least 10,000 new jobs to downtown Redmond in Redmond 2050. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Katie Kendall.
Good evening again. Again, for the record, my name is Katie Kendall with McCullough Hill, here to discuss the center's policy. I want to first discuss the growth allocation. I'm not going to repeat what Tom and Christina said, and I agree with what they are saying regarding downtown. But one of the key elements, and this goes to my point on some information, the center's policy includes the preferred growth alternative, but we still don't have the supplemental draft EIS or the details of that growth alternative so that we can understand what the plan is. And I know that will be coming, but I would ask that the Planning Commission not vote or approve the center's policy without the benefit of reviewing the preferred growth alternative and the supplemental draft EIS so that you can be fully informed as you make your decisions. I want to speak to two specific policies. The first is OV2, which prohibits standalone multifamily residential development in Overlake Village and OBAT. The only exception is for the OVMF, which is the Overlake Multifamily Zone, and that's for specific reasons such as parcel size or shape. It was said earlier that not every site can include a mixed-use building, and that's true whether you're in OVMF or in Overlake Village. We believe it's an overly restrictive policy that would likely discourage redeveloping of certain sites in Overlake. For example, I have a client that has a site in Overlake they're looking to redevelop. It has only 75 feet of frontage. Part of that frontage is going to be vehicular access. So if standalone residential development is prohibited, that means they cannot redevelop their property or they build interior empty storefront space or other space that doesn't get used, and that makes housing more expensive. Those are the results. Either no housing gets built or it gets more expensive. We just ask that there be flexibility in all the zones for allowances of standalone multifamily residential development when it's, not feasible to do retail or other development. Clayton had recommended looking to designate certain streets instead of an entire zone, and I think that's a great suggestion. Not every location is great for retail or even other types of mixed uses. The last provision I want to discuss is OV11, which requires design standards, require buildings to use low carbon green building techniques and other things. I think it's a great goal. What my issue with it and concern with it is that it shouldn't be part of the design guidelines that becomes a mandate. It should be pulled away from the mandatory design guidelines and created as a standalone goal to encourage developers to adopt these techniques and incentivize it and not mandate to do so as part of a comprehensive plan. And the concern there, and we've talked about this before, the comprehensive plan is what are our goals here, not necessarily what are the mandates we're going to push down into the regulations. That should be saved for regulations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katie. And that's everybody. At this point, I will close the public hearing for verbal comment, but leave it open for written comment. Okay.
Thank you.
Becky?
Okay, so at this time, we can start our issues matrix, or we can do another look through and respond. So,
Commissioners, do you have issues that you want to raise? Commissioner Parna.
Becky, I'm wondering, since we've had so many questions about the downtown allocations and basically I'm just trying to understand, could we have more information about how those growth allocations came to be? I know that we went through some stuff, but it wasn't in detail. So anything you can share will help everybody understand why we are where we are right now and maybe have a discussion if we need to. And the second thing that I do want to mention is the idea that we want to have flexibility in our spaces and our zoning is a good thing, but I think the way, and this is for the commissioners, I think everything that we approach should be with the lens of must have, nice to have. And the nice to have should be incentivized and the must have should be mandated, right? So at some point, if we have another discussion on this, we should look at it with that lens and hear all the public comments and really give it some thought. Thank you.
Thanks, Parna. Any more comments from commissioners? I'm looking at OV2 and it says an exception may be made if site conditions substantially limit mixed-use viability. And I guess I'm wondering why that doesn't satisfy the concerns. Katie, do you have a comment?
It specifically says in OVMS.
Oh, okay.
and just to clarify that, the flexibility built in there it does apply to all of the overlay zoning districts, not just the OVMF. Okay. But we could like bullet point, because it is a two-part sentence. If the site conditions is one bullet point, and then if it's in the OVMF is the second one. So we could put that in bullet points to make it a little bit more clear that the first bullet point does apply to OVAT and Overlake Village. And to go just really quickly to go back to Commissioner Parna's comments on the growth allocations, we do have, it's not a part of the public hearing tonight, but we do have the preferred alternative is going to City Council next week. And we have a ton of materials that are going to be made available to the public shortly thereafter about that. And it does include information about how we increased downtown job allocations. And in the review alternatives, the centers and centers and corridors, we had an allocation of 2% and 7%, and we, in the final preferred, we went to 18% of jobs were allocated to downtown. So we did listen to the comments, and we did allocate a lot more, not as much as Mr. Merkel is requesting, but we did listen to those comments and did shift a lot more jobs into downtown. So that will be explained further in detail at later conversations.
Sorry, she couldn't hear you on the mic. Yeah, why don't you go up to the mic and, because she's remote, if it's not on the mic, she couldn't hear you. Yeah, the mic's not on. And
Where's the, oh, there, now I'm on.
yeah.
So I think the exception can be an issue, and it's an issue more of process than of substance. I think the intention is good. But we have other code requirements, for example, pedestrian thoroughfare requirements in Overlake and downtown as well, where a developer can propose an alternate width, design, or location for those pedestrian thoroughfares. The issue is, in order to avail itself of one of those exceptions, a developer needs to advance its project to a pretty refined stage of development. So they're risking the time and the hundreds of thousands of dollars of design costs to get to that stage to maybe be told no by the city when they ask for an exception. I could see a similar process issue coming up with this type of exception. While we appreciate the fact that it's available, it may not be a workable exception.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity to respond.
Commissioner Parna.
Becky, I don't know, we've heard this evening also about the calendar and, what's going to be grandfathered in, what's opt-in, opt-out. Any clarity that you can provide all of us on where things stand and how this would be rolled out, I think would be really helpful, not just for all the developers out there, but also for us to understand where, how many projects are underway at which stage. It'll give us a really good idea of what we're looking at in terms of rollout. Would you be able to do that?
Yes, we can take a look and pull some numbers on the current projects in process. One of the things I do want to clarify, as mentioned, we did, as the part of the testing phase, we heard a lot of comments along that. How is this going to impact vesting in the projects that are currently in the review process? And what we will be doing for Overlake is in the adoption ordinance, we will outline if you are this type of project and you have submitted and are currently in the review process, you will get an option to choose if you want to continue under the code that was in effect at the time that you submitted your application, or if you'd like to switch and do the new one. So that will be a part of the adoption ordinance for Overlake. And then it's not every single thing, because there's little things that are currently in the process too that really aren't big, right? So we'll clarify that and we'll have it very cleanly outlined. If you are this, you may choose. And then everybody new coming in would just go under the new code, as typical, that any new application would be reviewed under the ordinance in effect at the time of submittal.
Thanks, Becky. I think that helps, but it also helps to have something that comes to everybody before the adoption ordinance is written
Yeah.
out. Because I think everybody is wondering where they stand, and there's a lot of uncertainty. I think it would be better for all of us to know where we stand on things and know how many projects are, are on the seesaw, if you
Yes.
will. So,
Yeah, we
you.
can draft out what that will look like and share it in the.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Commissioner Weston.
Can I just follow up on that? So when you say you'll draft it out, how does that language end up getting rolled into like a final presentation? It's not a policy. It's not.
No,
Where would
it'll
it get
actually
published?
be. Yeah. So what we can do is we can publish it with the documentation that shows, and I can actually include it in your issues matrix, right? So we say this is what we're looking to do with the ordinance document, but the ordinance itself won't be prepared until we go to the city council. So yes, it's a very good point to share that information, share what we're planning a little bit early, and definitely, I think it'll be very easy to do in your issues matrix, but we can also provide it as a separate call out box on the Overlake Updates website, right? So anybody who just goes to that website, they can see the little call back, hey, this is our plan, and they can see the information about if their project would qualify for that grace period.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else tonight for the centers element? Okay. I just want to say briefly that I appreciate all the developers showing up tonight. We hear you and also understand we're juggling a lot of different input. I hear you saying we don't like to use exceptions, we'd like to be in the mainstream, and understand that we're also hearing we need more non-residential spaces, right? So, we hear you and we're juggling all this. So if you don't get your way, it's not because we didn't listen to you. Okay.
And we have received a substantial amount of feedback from the community that's been extremely valuable in preparing the policies for this centers chapter. So I do want to acknowledge that as well. Our development community and our stakeholder community, especially our disability stakeholder community, have been extremely important in making sure that we're listening and know what the community is dealing with. So just from a staff perspective, thank you for everybody.
Okay, thanks, Becky. We will move on. We'll keep the written part of the public hearing open, and we'll move on now to Redmond 2050 land use element study session. Ian.
I will be joined by Senior Planner Lauren Alpert, and I'll pilot the PowerPoint while she takes the lead on the discussion.
Good evening. Thank you, Commissioners.
That one's.
These ones aren't working, so we need to speak into this one.
Okay. Is it on? Oh, yeah. Good evening. Okay, so this is an introduction to the land use element and policies. So we're just kicking this off. Oh, there it is. So as a reminder, these are sort of all of the elements and chapters of the comprehensive plan and the corresponding functional and strategic plans. Land use is highlighted there. So I think everyone has seen this graphic multiple times at this point. So how did we get here? How did we get to this land use chapter? So we kicked off early on with the community workshop. There's been visioning, there's been themes of equity, resiliency, and sustainability created. We've looked at policy considerations for the land use element, for the existing policies, along with stakeholder review. And then we began drafting. So we're on draft 1. So although it's draft 1, there's been a lot that has come before it, and there's going to be some drafts that come after it. So we're sort of right in that middle point right now. So yeah, there's been, as I said, a lot of review that has happened, looking at previously adopted plans, looking at the PSRC's plans, the King County policies, to make sure that all of our new policies and all of our existing policies meet their requirements, and that we're meeting our visioning. We're reviewing based on the vision the community had given us early in that process, and also those themes of equity, inclusion, sustainability, and resiliency. So one of the things that we want to keep as we're reviewing this first draft of policies, the main thing we want to be really looking at is, are we on the right track? Are we going in the right direction based on meeting our state, our county, our regional requirements, meeting the community's requirements for our vision that have been leading up to this first draft. So introduction to the land use element. The land use element really sets the stage for the future growth of the community. While all of the chapters are important in Redmond 2050, land use, we'd like to say, is the star of the show. It certainly is one of the largest chapters in Redmond 2050. I think there's approximately 40 pages of policies in there. So I appreciate all of your diligent reading of those policies. And what comes out of those policies is also the future land use map, which then dictates our zoning and the look and feel of our community going forward. So some of the land use policies, some of the things that have been updated, we've looked at reflecting our community values. Importantly, also meeting our targets for housing supply, affordability, and jobs, especially with some of those new state and regional requirements that came about sort of as we were drafting this. So we really focused on meeting those requirements as we developed this chapter. So by the numbers, if you also recall, we did a modern scan, so also how can we consolidate, how can we reduce redundancy in our plan, in our policies, in our comp plan. So we went from a total of approximately 67 policies down to 41. We've reduced the land use designations from 13 to 11, and this is a big one, going from a total of 49 zones in the city of Redmond to potentially 20 zones when adopted. So sort of looking at how we can simplify, make our zoning code and our land use designations a little bit more user-friendly. So some significant policy updates and changes, creating a new neighborhood residential designation, so that allows kind of a greater variety of housing choices to be integrated and some non-residential uses to foster that idea of complete neighborhoods. As you recall, we're having a lot of conversations with the community right now about this concept of complete neighborhoods. So that's reflected in this first draft. We're also looking at the structures of mixed-use designations, kind of dividing it between centers and citywide, and looking at citywide mixed-use designations, including mixed-use zones at different scales and intensities. So that's also a lot of what our public engagement work has been ongoing so far this spring and summer. So here is kind of what the current adopted plan is, and also just kind of giving you a look at what the proposed update to the plan will be. So looking at what that land use designation is on the left, and then what the consistent zoning would be. And our community engagement is going to continue through the summer. this is going to be a large component of what we're going to be talking to the community about all summer long at Derby Days this weekend and continuing on. And then hoping to be back here this fall with a draft number 2 for you.
Okay.
So happy to dive in now.
We'll start with Commissioner Aparna.
I actually have a lot of questions, but what I'll do is I'll ask the ones which I think is to my mind, the most confusing, and then everybody can take turns, and then I can email you the rest of the questions.
Yeah, I'm sure there's 40
So
pages of text.
I just want to start with the zoning designations and just the slide. Yeah, that one, right? So for me, what I'm trying to understand is when we have a zone which is neighborhood residential and a neighborhood multifamily, is there a, for me, I'm seeing if we're opening up residential in terms of having all sorts of housing in the residential neighborhoods, then why would we have a separate zoning for multifamily?
That's a great question. The high level is that the multifamily would be a bit more intense, where we're trying to get into the actual apartments, and the neighborhood residential would encompass everything from detached single-family homes to all of the missing middle. So because of new state requirements, there's a variety of ways that we need to approach kind of intensity other than just dwelling units per acre. So our ballpark measurement is that it would be roughly a maximum intensity of R8 or R10, but it won't actually be reflected in that kind of framing.
Okay, thank you. That was one question. And then along those lines were whether we are looking at, when we look at business park, right? For me, I thought we were focusing more on moving towards a more flexible zoning. So if a business park wants to have, say, commercial component, right? Like retail component rather. So does that still, how flexible are these zoning? For me, that's what I want to understand, because we've talked a lot about flexibility for the city, adaptability. So the less restrictions we have on the zoning piece, the better it is, right? So I don't know, maybe it's already there. So yeah, so that's one part. And then equivalent on that side would be the idea of having urban recreation and park and open space. Why should they be different? Is it because of the size or the location? I'm just trying to understand if we need all these many designations, right? So, and the last question on this table was how much RA5 or semi-rural areas do we really have? Oh, like if you're building up a bulk of the city, how many of those zones are there in terms of parcels right now? So I'm just asking questions. Sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's a good question. I have a slight follow-up on one of those, which is, as if I recall correctly, business park zone currently allows housing. Is that going to continue, or?
Do you want to check that's housing?
It's an accessory use now, and I think, if I recall correctly, we're expanding it to be more explicit about dormitories, but I may be getting that confused. I'll have to research and get back to you.
Okay.
Yeah. I'd have to, I don't want to give you incorrect
Yeah,
information.
this is, but I remember when we were doing the Willows area, it's a business park, but I was pretty sure that as it was, it had some housing available to it when we were.
As I recall, it's permitted as an accessory use right now.
Yeah. Commissioner Weston.
I had one more question on this particular slide. I would love next time we see this to have a map of what it used to be and a map of, like a very draft map is fine of just what we're going to, because it's really, I know some of these, but I don't know all 49, and I can't quite picture this. And that would really help. Like a map would just ground things.
Yeah, I think we're working on a map.
Okay.
So it is forthcoming, but.
Yeah, or even just including the old map would be great, because it's, I don't know. The details matter.
Sorry, Chair, I'm refraining. Okay, the other stuff is just on these tables. So the neighborhood residential, when you have the zoning for that, how are we going to address those resident-serving businesses or in-home commercial, like home businesses, or the things that we're talking about in EV that we want to encourage? How would that translate in the zoning when we say neighborhood residential? I know that it's in there in some policies, but it's not referenced in all of the policies. Specifically, we have some things in LU 30, LU 37, but not necessarily in others. So I'm just trying to understand, like, shouldn't it be something that is offered everywhere? And referenced across all the neighborhoods as potential, as reducing barriers. I think that's what we want to go for. We're not saying this is what it should be, but if you want to do this, how far can we push this, right? So, thank you.
Other comments from commissioners? Commissioner Van Nyman.
Related to what Commissioner Weston was asking for, I think for people who've been around longer, it's easier for them to connect the dots and see where this goes. But what I need help with is, part of what you're saying is, okay, so you have to teach me what the implications are here. Right? Like when we have all these guest speakers, it's super helpful because to me, reading this policy, well, I don't understand the implications of that, right? These are the experts, and some of you here are more expert. But I really need help understanding and asking from city staff, what does this mean? So that's what I would want to see, and I think a map would be helpful. Getting there.
Yeah, we can make a tool that will help lay those things out.
So I have a question. Looking through the draft itself, there are a number of land use element policies that have been deleted, that have been, let's see, where's one? Now I can't find one. I had one just a minute ago. That have been put off to a different, the community. Yeah, the community. Can you say a little more about that?
Yes, so we're adding a new chapter, a new element, the community design element. So that's going to replace and add on to the community character and historic preservation chapter. So we'll be coming to you with that chapter this fall. Yes. I'll have to double check on the schedule exactly when, but it will kind of incorporate a lot of those policies because they make more sense to be, they deal more with the design and the look and feel of the rather than exactly the land use. but we'll be coming back with that chapter.
Okay.
And it's going to include our centers as well. So downtown, Southeast Redmond will be in that chapter, as well as policies on corridors and how we treat our corridors. So those areas in between our neighborhoods and our centers. Is there anything you want to add to that, Ian? I know you were doing some work on it as well.
In addition to kind of like the standard conventions of design, things like setbacks and like easements, we're also looking at different ways we can create different feelings. So whether that's view corridors or certain types of tree canopy allocations, we're really looking at the full package and bringing those conversations to our community members to figure out prioritization and what they feel is appropriate to include and what not to include.
Yeah, so some of the other things that we're looking at specifically in that chapter are site and building design, historic preservation, looking at inclusive and universal design standards, not just for buildings, but for our community in general. Sort of what standards we want for the public realm, so that area between the street and the building, which play such an important role in a community. And we're also looking at accessibility. And also, how do we make, I mean that on for universal design standards, but also how do we make our community culturally accessible and diverse? So that it's gonna include all of those things.
Commissioner Weston.
So I don't know if it's okay to start jumping into specific policies.
Go for it.
Okay.
I'm gonna write it all down.
I'm going to start with my most important group, and then maybe we can circle back to me later. First of all, I really liked the tone that I saw emerging in this draft already. It really felt like a shift into something a lot more modern and a lot more livable, and I just really appreciate that. The one thing that did kind of keep coming up for me is there were a lot of places where we removed examples, but then the words that were left didn't necessarily mean what the policy seemed to used to mean to me. So I'm going to just go through and do a bunch of examples. So for LU 14, and there's a bunch to follow about essential public facilities.
When you say, can you say what you're saying, the old policy number or the new policy number?
New policy numbers.
Okay.
So LU 14 and then a series to follow that were all around public facilities, and there were different vocabulary words used. So in the initial one, they didn't use the word essential public facilities. Later down, they did. And it was like churches were included in some and not in others. So just kind of getting a little bit more clear about like the definitions on what we mean by that. That would really help. Another one, so when you look at LU 18, new numbers, there was this example, the old policy had a whole list of examples about what it meant to promote physical health and well-being. And without those examples, to me, it sort of sounded like maybe sidewalks. Like, instead of this whole list of like building materials, and it was a really broad policy before, I actually almost wonder if it just makes sense to delete it entirely. But leaving it as like where it is right now, it's such a like promoting well-being is a very broad.
That's old policy LU 18. New
Sorry,
policy,
it might have
LU
been.
16. Yeah.
Thank you. I tried. It's so hard when the numbering switches.
Yeah, I understand, but I'm looking at new policy and going, LU 18 is about TDR.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't know if this is old or new. The next one was LU 19, which was about green infrastructure.
That's old policy LU 19.
Old policy LU 19. Thank you, Sherry. Okay. So to me, green infrastructure sounds like solar panels or maybe high capacity electrical infrastructure or stormwater systems or something. And when I looked at the definition in the old policy, it was about green space. So like to only have green infrastructure as a term, but not all of the things that it's like, we're not talking about buildings here. We're not talking about like something that was constructed. We're talking about like our open space. That one was confusing to me. And then one of the last one.
Number was that again? I'm sorry.
That was old LU.
Old LU 19, new LU 17.
And then a bunch of the LU 28, 27, 28, and 31, which are the ones that I think were added to satisfy the talk about like the multifamily residential and the not. I really like the way these were written until we got to the part about permitting non-residential uses that support resident day-to-day living, because to me, I could make so many things fit that. Like I could make a package distribution center support day-to-day living, and I don't think that's what we're talking about. Or I could make a car wash or a gas station support day-to-day living, and I don't think that's what we're talking about. So maybe getting a little bit more defined on that, because in all of these examples, these are just things where I think these policies are doing something really important, but I want to make sure that the definitions either jump off the page or are actually defined, or are listed in an index at the end or something, so that people, when they see a term like that clearly has a definition, like there isn't a question of where this definition is coming from. It's very easy for them to look it up, and I think it'll help also reduce both confusion and the back and forths about how are we actually using
So that was
the land.
New LU 27.
Yes.
Yeah. It's fine.
Thank you for clarifying.
Just making sure that we're all talking about the same policy.
Yes.
Go ahead, Commissioner Parno.
So LU 31, so I'm going to only talk about the new policy numbers, okay, just for clarity's sake. So LU 31 references citywide mixed-use designation purpose with, neighborhood, commercial, and all of that stuff, right? Now, can it be also kind of, can it be combined with 27 and 28, because they are talking about the multifamily and the residential thing. The text is kind of repetitive in the sense of support of businesses. So perhaps we can do away with one more. Basically, it's saying the same thing, except that this is calling it out separately. So I don't know if we need it that way, but for streamlining and to be very clear that the residential neighborhoods will allow certain commercial uses, for clarity's sake, that was one. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about was LU 37. Let me just go down there to 37. Oh, that's the new policy, 37, okay. Sorry. 37 is a business park designation, right? So what we've got here is all the compatible uses and so on, but we don't talk about any kind of express density here. Now, I don't know if that's deliberate or density or intensity is not really committed here. Is that coming later? I'm not sure. Because from what I read here, it could be one of those 1 to 2 story business parks, right? It's not precluding those, and we don't want to encourage those old style campus kind of buildings, right? So that's one. And LU 32, which is, sorry, I'm just scrolling up and down here. We're talking about, again, the same thing about the business park and so on, and then the industrial and manufacturing growth center in Southeast Redmond. We do need to kind of look at it in terms of how we have addressed the protections for the mining things, right? We're talking about no groundwater contamination and all of that. That's LU 35. LU 35 talks about all the environmental protections of this, the water and the well system and all of that. Maybe LU 32 should also reflect that, because we are talking manufacturing and we've heard from the public about this. So it's a good thing to indicate that we are going to protect the water and the environment even while encouraging, this will be LU 32,
That's LU 30, okay.
right? Did I get the numbers right? Yeah, I think I did, okay. And the last one I had was LU 41 is the parks piece. I just wanted a clarification whether food trucks would be part of that, because it says non-motorized and then it says commercial uses. So I really don't want to preclude food trucks from the parks. I'm already planning my summers, okay?
That's right. We want food trucks in the parks.
Yeah.
We'll die on that hill.
Yeah, so, and LU 38 was the last one. There are a couple of other small things which I can email out, but LU 38, okay, let me just go back to LU 38. Yeah, so again, LU 38 is talking about everything, it talks about water, but we need to make sure that it's like clearly stated. I think it's there, but maybe it needs to be a little more like bolder, and that's all I have. The smaller stuff I'll just mail, okay?
Yeah, like if there's typos or copy editing.
Yeah, those kind of things, I don't want to put it in here, so, thank you.
Commissioner Nueva Camina.
Lauren, thank you for for all of the rigorous typing and note-taking that you're taking right now on all of this. I appreciate it. Going over to LU 35, new LU 35, I had noticed throughout all of this that we've been simplifying, which is great. But LU 35 stuck out to me because that's when we expanded, we extrapolated from the original LU 59. So before we were just saying mining, and then now we're calling it out specifically sand, gravel, asphalt, et cetera. So I was wanting clarification as to why we did that.
If you look at old LU 58, I think that's why. LU 58 and 59 got combined together.
Gotcha, okay.
Yep. I was like, I have to look at it, but yeah, I think that's what happened.
Yeah.
And then a question just on word usage on FW13 on page 2, all the way at the top.
What was it?
It says retains and encourages a resilient economy. And as soon as I hear resilient, then I hear that recovery. And wondering if the word that we're looking for is sustainability, because then we're looking at a more diverse economy. So we're looking at multiple economic drivers rather than, just a handful, then we're looking at a broader. So sustainable, where then we wouldn't have an overall city economic recovery that would be needed, but rather sustainable would be we're pushing and pulling different levers in our local economy.
Okay. Which policy was that again? It was FW?
That was FW 13.
Thank you.
On page 2. LU 11. The verbiage felt weird when I was reading it, like avoid the creation. So are we talking about preventing? And again, just in the spirit of simplifying. And agreeing with Commissioner Aparna on LU 16 on page 7. My note in here was, did we oversimplify? And that was when talking about encouraging walking, bicycling, and just taking it into well-being.
Which one was that? Which policy was that?
New policy, LU 16.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, thank you.
Commissioner Weston.
Okay, I have a bunch more. So for the framework policy 13, I didn't know if high technology has a specific definition versus just technology.
Low technology.
Like mid technology. I don't know. It might actually mean something, but if not, I would recommend just simplifying. For framework policy 14, there were blanks where I think we actually do have numbers now for the targets. But then I was also wondering if it made sense to add the affordable housing targets in there, because I think that's important. And then LU1 is a similar thing where we talk about affordability of housing, but I don't know if we want to talk about affordability of commercial space or retail, because that's something that came up in our overlay conversation.
Which one was that? That was
LU1.
LU1. Oh, okay.
And I'll go through and then but if it's good to stop, then I can stop. Okay. So LU 12 and 13, I was wondering if it would be possible to actually condense those into a single. They seem really similar, but if not, then adding that equity piece that's in LU 13 to LU 12 seems like it would be smart. LU 20, so new LU 20, I don't know if we want to keep the funding part that used to be about taxes or fees that used to be in the old LU 20. That part didn't get brought over when that policy got merged.
Which policy was that? LU?
So if you look at old LU 20,
Okay.
there was a bunch of pieces about like how you were actually paying for some of those changes that weren't brought forward into the new LU 20, which was
LU 18. Okay. Okay, I'll take a look at it.
and then if it's okay to keep going. So LU 34 about adult zones.
That's the one I forgot to write down.
I think we also talked about including those in overlay, and I didn't see that mentioned.
What is the definition of an adult entertainment?
I'll defer to the Supreme Court on that.
I was afraid.
There's actually a
Google search
definition
it, but
in
it's
the
there.
there's actually a definition in the definition, that huge definitions list.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, is a bar
No,
an adult entertainment?
more adult than a bar, Sherry.
Well, I'm just saying, that's a place that only adults can go.
Which,
So that was LU 34. And I just wanted to make sure that if overlay should be included, that we're adding it. And I don't remember what part of overlay it was. We talked about it earlier in the spring.
oh, I remember this conversation.
Yeah.
I remember the conversation about whether marijuana retail should be in business park and manufacturing park, so.
And then my last one was about LU 41, and I had two questions for that. I wasn't totally clear what a private park is, and if, that was just a confusion point to me. The private open space made more sense, but I wasn't sure about the private park. And then the second question was if part of the goal of this would be to specify, instead of the motorized usage, I think it's a little bit confusing, but I don't know if what we're actually saying is we don't want it developed. So we don't want pavement, or we don't want non-permeable surfaces, or I don't know if fences are a problem. I feel like this is giving a lot of examples, but it's not saying what we're actually trying to prevent happening in this land. So maybe just kind of returning back to what the actual, what are we trying to preserve here, or what are we trying to protect with this policy? Okay, and that's everything. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Parna.
SW13, when we talk about resilience, retains and encourages a resilient economy, which includes research, development, high technology, and manufacturing uses. I think it's great, but there is something to be said for resilience in low tech. If your grid goes down, your resilience is about how do you manage low tech, how do you manage with low energy consumption. So it actually it's not all encompassing as a definition. I don't know if you want to add more detail or kind of say, I know it says encourages and includes, but you do not want it to be that we are positioning our city as only one type of city. Right? We want to encourage like arts and crafts and all of the other stuff, right? So. I believe my mic was off, so I will repeat that. Basically, for FW13, looking at resilient economy cannot be just a high-tech deal. We need to think what happens in a low-tech situation. There are things that can help our resilience, industries that can help it. So. And resilience is also about smaller businesses and so on. So it's actually a much bigger definition than what is here. So thank you.
That seems to tie back to the earlier comment we had about a sustainable economy and like multifaceted. So
what do we mean there? Do we mean recovers quickly, recovers from recession? Do we mean recover from disaster? Do we mean, does it mean that we don't suffer from boom and bust? What does it mean? What are we trying to say?
We'll take a crack at some other language and see if we can accompany all that. Mm-hmm. Might need to go into 2 different bullets.
Commissioner Nueva Camina.
At our last meeting, we had a lot of inclusionary language around community members with various abilities. And when we come into this one specifically, old LU8 and new LU8, actually it's the same, we're seeing, when I read this, it was a hard shift because we had just been going through changing up our language. So here we're going from non-motorized systems to active transportation options. And of course, we went over quite a bit about the problematic term being non-motorized. But then active transportation, are we jumping from the frying pan into the flames? And do we need to have more inclusive language with that? Mm-hmm. And there were several other places within the document that I found that as well. But I promise I won't go through them all.
Well, that's perfect because we want to ensure there's consistency in our inclusive language. So for example, if we look at new FW15, we kind of have language that is also getting at that, but seems a little bit more accessible. How does the commission feel about that component? The variety of travel modes, including walking, rolling, bicycling, busing, and other accessible forms of travel.
FW15.
New and old.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Parna.
I think busing doesn't sound good.
Transit.
It really does not sound good. It has a lot of different connotations.
Yeah.
Transit.
Yep.
So would this be an appropriate place for multimodal? I mean, does that fit? I don't know.
That does line up. Mm-hmm. I guess the question there would be like, is that explicitly accessible enough? Is it too jargony? And do we want to have kind of that very explicit, accessible forms of travel included in that component?
We might be getting into the gray when we start saying accessible modes of travel, right? Because then, going back to also language that we've heard earlier tonight about whether or not vehicles are accessible. Mm. So then when we're talking about accessibility in various abilities, and then accessibility because of socioeconomic status. Mm-hmm. then, it's getting tricky in the language, but I want to make sure that we're intentional and clear with it, so that it can't be easily misunderstood.
We'll try some revisions, and then we'll also look for all of the policies that touch on that and try and make sure it's consistent throughout.
Yeah, throughout each of the elements. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Commissioner Woodyer.
I mean, I would argue that FW15, I like the simplicity, I like the clarity, and that's more so than that other version that you saw there. So I don't like I think adding that multimodal and these other types of words to simplify actually creates less simplification and less clarity. I think the FW15 works.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Commissioner West.
Sorry to weigh in. Sorry, I'll be fast. I actually really liked active transportation too, because but I think it's different than accessible transportation. So I think actually, like both of those points work. I think I like this as a very clear way of saying you're not sitting in your car by yourself. But I also really think that what we're talking about is accessibility and making sure that people of all abilities can use like multiple ways of getting around Redmond, and that they're not excluded from any parts of the community because of the style of transportation that they need to use. So I kind of don't even want to get too prescriptive on like what all the non-car options are.
Well, there's so many new ones.
There's so many new ones, right? And like multimodal, I only really hear before trail, so I'm not, that almost might be too prescriptive also, because a lot of what we're talking about is roads and connections and I don't know. Anyway.
Play around with the language.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure you already have.
Anything else on this topic? Okay. So we'll wrap this up for now. I'm going to propose that we take a 5-minute break since we still have a substantial amount of work to do, and we've been at this for a while. So, Chris, we're going to take 5 and be back here. It's 8:47, so we'll be back here at 8:52. Thanks, and welcome back to the Planning Commission meeting. Now we'll do Redmond 2050 Housing Element and Regulations Study Session. Ian, start us off.
Hello, my name is Ian Lefcourt. I'm a senior planner with Long Range Planning. I use he, him pronouns, and we're going to go over the housing element final draft. I will note up front that there are a few more pieces of regulation that are going forward with this element that did not make it into your packet. All the content is ready to go for the next packet, and I can send out updates afterwards and update the website accordingly. The housing element is one of the Phase 1 elements of the Comprehensive Plan update. There we go. As you might imagine, this was one of the most discussed topic among our stakeholders, whether that's elected officials, commissioners, regional partners, our community members themselves, and of course, regional requirements from the state, from the county, and from the Puget Sound Regional Council. The message was loud and clear. There needs to be more housing, there needs to be more housing choices, and there needs to be more equitable housing. Now, the way you can approach this combines a lot of different considerations, but they often all feed into each other. So, for example, if we improve the housing supply of, say, family-sized condominiums, right? That creates a very specific piece of housing that serves very specific needs. And so they often all feed into each other. The two components that are kind of separate from that are creating the home ownership opportunities, right? So that's not just the building type, but the tenure, and also the environmental sustainability and the energy efficiency of the building stock. These were, as I mentioned, reflected in basically every section across, but we tried to make the element more accessible by creating a clear narrative and then a clear demarcation of these different policy sections. Very similar when we look at the state, regional, and county policy emphasis. One of the differences is the D, reporting. The countywide planning policies in particular have a lot of emphasis on giving updates on the actual progress to ensure that the planning is not just a document, but that real outcomes are occurring. And locally, some of the opportunities that were presented to us were, one, our light rail stations, huge opportunity for transit-oriented development, equity, and providing a variety of different lifestyle choices. Our centers, especially Overlake, and the reason we're saying especially Overlake is that there are some economic considerations and some kind of physical site-based considerations that make that area more plausible to attain higher levels of density than, say, downtown where we have our Cara. The housing choices, as we mentioned earlier with the neighborhood residential land use, trying to give people more options, give the market more options, and give the developers more options so that our community members can find the best option for themselves. And of course, through all of the Redmond 2050 update is our themes of equity, sustainability, and resiliency. There are many requirements for the housing element, and there are new legislation requirements as well that basically create new housing element requirements as well. So there's like direct new requirements and indirect new requirements. On this page, it's mainly about getting your housing stock built, preserved, and improved, making sure that the city areas have duplexes and triplex considerations and townhomes, so some of that middle housing conversation, the relationship to employment locations and the role of ADUs. Currently, right now, our jobs to housing units is about a ratio of 3. So some of our stakeholders mentioned earlier in this Planning Commission meeting, trying to figure out how we can get housing units closer to jobs and balance that out a bit. And then the housing need and projected housing need based on income bands is really one of the biggest parts, right? So that is one of the new pieces of legislation that's really defining how our housing supply could be reflected to meet those different populations. Very much the same point of emphasis here, but just a lot more words, right? Like, here's all the different types of special needs housing we need to get. There's all the types of income bands we need to meet. And then the third row is really where we start getting into one of the new points of emphasis, which is equity and remediation, and really trying to figure out ways to undo past harms, prevent future harms, and create a more equitable community with a special emphasis on racially disparate impacts. These continue to reinforce that theme with some of the specifics. So we have to identify areas that are higher displacement, higher risk of displacement. We have to undo racially disparate impacts, and we need to establish anti-displacement policies. This final draft has some differences from the previous draft you all reviewed. One of the big ones is that we created a technical appendix between the King County planning policies and the state requirements for that reporting. A lot of different kind of data is required to be put in the housing element, but in an effort to keep it more accessible and streamlined, we put some of that heavier analysis into this technical appendix. So that includes our land capacity to meet housing needs and our housing inventory and analysis. Now, that land capacity is a big requirement, and essentially it says when we look at our preferred growth alternative and our land use, we need to demonstrate that there's a plausible outcome of meeting our stated housing allocated growth from that land use pattern. And then another piece that we added is addressing a state requirement to be more prescriptive of how affordable housing on land owned by religious organizations is allowed and the density bonuses associated with that. So when we go into the regulations themselves, one thing I'll say up front is that these are not the only regulations that impact housing that will happen as a result of the Redmond 2050 update. When those land use consolidations occur, that will obviously have enormous changes to the zoning code. But right now, this is the pieces that we'll implement currently as we're implementing the 2050 policy. The topics are listed on the left, and the code sections and chapters are listed on the right. Now, this is not a one-to-one. Many of the topics touch multiple different pieces of code, and you'll note that there's a little space between language updates and small lot short plat process. Those bottom 3 bullet points are the ones that were not initially provided in this packet, so we'll have opportunities to go into more depth with those. The affordable housing on land owned by religious organizations, it's implementing state requirements and essentially just adding the actual language because there's no provisions currently, and the proposed would allow affordable housing on land owned by religious organizations except in some zones to occur, and then it defines how it could occur. Inclusionary zoning and overlay. And earlier we heard a comment from the audience about, well, why are we changing the inclusionary zoning and just overlay? Shouldn't we treat all zones, update them all at the same time? And the reason why this is occurring now for overlay is because overlay is on that kind of slightly earlier track of updating compared to the rest of the city. So that's the reason why there's that discrepancy in timing. And this piece is kind of an underlying component because there is that stacked incentive program that is going into overlay. So this was just kind of like a base layer upon which the different incentives are built. For emergency housing and emergency shelters, due to state approaches for land capacity analysis, one of the recommendations from Commerce is to remove limitations on siting and spacing and limitations on density. Now, this does not impact the actual operation of these facilities. It's simply like where they could be allowed to be, right? Affordable housing parking allowance, one of the hot topics. We had multiple stakeholders. Part of these ongoing discussions. Since January, we've had multiple meetings with the stakeholder groups trying to figure out where we can all meet. And the issue is between we had for-profit developers, we had nonprofits, we had regional public entities, and there were some mutually exclusive goals. There was just no way we were going to please everybody. So the approach we took is, okay, we are going to provide a parking allowance. We are not guaranteeing a stall for those affordable housing units, but they all get the parking allowance. And the reason why all of them get it, regardless if they have a vehicle they need to park or not, is because otherwise, as FutureWise noted, you would be incentivizing car ownership, which goes against the sustainability goals. And we hope that this will have a minimal impact on the cash flow of projects, because historically, the practice in Redmond was that every affordable housing unit did just get a free stall. And this kind of discussion on the amendment started because more projects started having parking ratios where there were less parking stalls than there were housing units. Oops. And so when that occurred, we needed to figure out a more explicit way of allocating the parking. And the other component is that if a project has a parking ratio less than 0.75, there is no longer an obligation to provide allowances. So we hope that would incentivize further reducing the parking provided in a pursuit of saying, all right, let's take transit, let's reduce our environmental impact that way. And just as a quick aside, Redmond 2050 in general is moving towards the direction of getting rid of parking minimums for these kinds of projects. So it would be up to the developer to determine what that minimum amount of parking would be for a case-by-case basis of the projects. Permit fees for affordable housing. This would be a tweak to the exemptions for affordable housing projects from more types of permit fees. In addition, we applied that same coverage of exemption to city projects and environmental restoration projects. And then we also had some language updates. So, for example, conforming with state law, we changed marijuana to cannabis. And to be more inclusive, instead of senior citizens, we changed it just to seniors. So broadly, these are the questions for the commission. Are we meeting the GMA requirements? What questions do you have about the element and the associated regulations? And what would you like to see addressed before we go to council? And I know we gave a lot of content to Planning Commission, but I feel like this chapter in particular is one where we really want to get the inclusive language as precise as possible. So I would welcome really going over that with a fine-tooth comb. Yeah.
Commissioner Nueva Camino.
Thank you, Chair. One of my concerns that I've got around affordable housing is how quickly our AMI is growing. And I'm not sure where we start this conversation at or whose table it ends up at, but I haven't heard it really discussed yet. And we're talking about sustainable housing and decreasing housing instability. But 6 years ago, our AMI was 82,000. Right now is just released at 146. So my concern is that for an Arch resident who perhaps they moved in 3 years ago, what are we putting in place for them to continue to qualify for their apartment, for their unit? Because if they were to be ran through again, they likely would no longer qualify because the AMI is increasing so quickly. So if they don't qualify, now they're concerned they're now in a survival mode. They don't know what's happening with their housing, which is a completely different behavior. This is where we start seeing behavioral health issues. So looking for where does that conversation start? Because we are talking, and I brought this up before, you're just reminding us that at that time, that was before the updated numbers came out, and at 80%, we're still talking about $100,000.
Yeah. That is a very difficult topic that's occurring in our community, and that's one of the reasons why there's such a pointed emphasis on focusing on those deeper AMI levels, because as you noted, I mean, the AMI is going up so fast that many of the households that would need affordable housing the most, even if they could get into affordable cost-controlled units, an 80% AMI unit with those rent limits would still be vastly more expensive than would serve those households' needs. So we're focusing on those deeper levels of AMI, so the 50%, and in the nonprofit and kind of public sphere, we're focusing on 30% and below, including special needs. And we're also focusing on anti-displacement practices, and we're hoping that in harmony with, say, our human services team, we can prevent displacement before it occurs and get people resources as they need before it actually becomes too onerous and they become displaced. But it's an uphill battle, and all of these pieces are trying to hopefully minimize as much of that harm as possible.
Second point that I wanted to make was around the history of the development of the East Side. And this is a conversation where we're starting to actually talk about our history, so that, and not coming from a place of shame or blame or anything like that, but to have a better understanding so that we can start doing better as we're having the equity conversation. And it's interesting because we're talking about parking and cars, and it being discretionary, but that was the whole thing with the development of the East Side. You had to have a car in order to live on the East Side, right? There was no other way for you to live over here. And just pointing out that's the interesting piece tonight. We're talking about equitable housing, but we also have to keep in mind, like, where did we come from? How were we developed, so we can better understand why we do the things that we do, instead of, oh, that's just how we do it. Thank you, Ian.
Commissioner Woodyer?
I just had a question for a clarification. You mentioned that every affordable unit gets a free stall. So if you were only to give the stall, is that on a unit by unit, even if someone has a car or not have a car? I think that's the case, and it...
Yes, previously, the practice was every affordable housing unit got a stall, regardless if they had a car or not.
So that's tied to the unit?
Yeah, previously.
Okay. So now, if there's an individual in that unit who doesn't have a car, they're still getting the credit. I think that's my understanding.
Yes, they would still get the allowance.
Okay.
They could use that for a transit, they could use it for an Orca pass, they could use it on something else, but... Shopping. They could use it on... There's no limit in our code on what they can use it on.
Okay.
Commissioner Aparna.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Ian. So I wanted to talk about the AMI, have a conversation about the AMI as well. As we've heard tonight, 30% AMI number of units, or 50%, 10% units at 50% AMI. If the AMI is increasing, I back of the envelope calculation says that a teacher in Lake Washington School District gets around $65,000, $70,000 a year. Now that would make them a little over 50% AMI. So while I really think the city does need to do the 30% AMI, a bulk of the working class people are going to be between the 40, 50% mark and the 70% mark. From a standpoint of not, it's very difficult to say this, but I don't want to disenfranchise anybody, but that is a cause for concern, that our teachers, our nurses who are in that range, they're priced out because the AMI is increasing so rapidly. They actually would qualify in the 50 to 80% range, right? So that's something that I don't know how it would work out in all the policies, but it's something that we should be cognizant of. So even if it's a tier of, okay, do 2% of, 30% AMI, or at a higher percent AMI, put a smaller percentage, something which is working that in as well. That's the first part. And then the second part is the whole thing about ownership is in HO 21. Again, ownership is something that I think the middle class aspires to. And right now, it's not as strong. And I know there are other restrictions in terms of, condo policies statewide and stuff. But for me, I see that as everything is screaming rental except for this one line in HO 21. I would like to see a little more emphasis on ownership. How, I don't know. I mean, you probably have a better sense of if we can squeeze something like that in, because, and I know Commissioner Sheffrin always has been talking about the ownership piece, and I think that's pretty important for us to address, because again, 30 years down the line, we put in ownership, but then everybody's in a rental by the end of it. Yes, there are people living, but then where is the aspiration to continue living, right? If you can afford it now, tomorrow I want a house. I want to own my own place, even if it's tiny, even if it's a shoebox, right? So that's the part from a long-term perspective, right? And the last one is a very silly one, but HO 24 uses the word posture. No, it sounds bad, because it sounds like we're not deeply committing to adaptability. It just shows that we might be. So that's a word quibble, so thank you.
We're going to look like we're adaptable, but we're not really going to be adaptable. Commissioner Van Nymen.
So I want to understand the math on the AMI discussion and the development and the notion that, we have very legitimate concerns from our development community that the math will no longer pencil out and that we're going to end up with a lower supply of housing. I mean, from an economics perspective, that makes total sense to me. Do we want to come up with solutions for 50 to 80%? Absolutely. Are they different solutions than 80 to 100%? Probably, right? That you can't just take the same model that worked so successfully at 80% and drop the number down to 80% or down to 50% and expect the same results. And so, I know you guys have relationships with these developers. This is not the first time tonight that you heard these comments, right? So you've had these people walk you through, they've walked you through the math, I'm assuming, and that they are very sincere in their concern that they have thousands of housing units that are not going to be built if we make this change. So I would like to understand how we think this is still going to pencil out from a development perspective, and that we won't end up with unintended consequences. I'd like to understand the math.
Absolutely. That was kind of the big piece of our Housing Action Plan implementation grant. Our consultants basically did financial modeling on the different scenarios about tweaking, the number of affordable units versus the affordability level of the units. And so currently I can provide a written comment that will give a deeper walkthrough, but the high level is they do seem to give approximately equal returns, because the drop from 80% to 50%, we also lowered the amount of required units in our IZ. The MFTE does still have it at 10%, so that's a little, the same amount of units, but the AMI drops from 60 to 50 for the MFTE. So we're hoping, based on the model, which was developed in harmony with other jurisdictions, with developer stakeholders, that the direction of it will indicate that it's approximately equal return. Now,
I mean, it's a big deal.
it is.
And you want to be really sure that you're making the right decision here. And, you know, as was pointed out, a lot of these ideas were developed in a previous economic time. And, you know, perhaps we have a longer-term vision that this is something that we're not just going to make a decision based on today's economic environment, but, you know, you also want your policies to be resilient. And, you know, if we can't make this pencil out today, can we really make it pencil out during a recession?
Mm-hmm.
We being the developers, and the idea that you're in a relationship with your developers because they're the ones who are building your housing units. And, you know, I really need to be convinced that this is the right answer. I don't know the answer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying it's a big deal.
It is.
I will note that we are operating on a longer time horizon. This is Redmond 2050. So the fact that interest rates are high and financing is hard to get right now that's just the way things are right now. It's not the way things were a couple of years ago, and it may or may not be the way things are a couple of years from now. We have to try something because we don't have housing for the 50 to 80% AMI, much less the 30 to 50% AMI. I mean, we just don't have it. Yes, it's true. We've done the best of any city on the east side at providing affordable housing for the 80% AMI. But we don't have it, for the most part, for people below that. And, you know, I talk with people who struggle to live in this area and are, you know, just now getting information about what they're getting 6-month notices because we require a 6-month notice for rent increases of more than 10%, and they're getting notices that their rent is going to go up significantly, more than 10%, at the end of this year. So we got to try something
between like that you're talking about, that you're capturing. That there's a trade-off between trying to capture the 50 to 80% versus the decrease in the overall supply that you're likely to see.
The model, granted not in this very specific, difficult time to construct, seemed to imply that we would not expect development to significantly reduce because of that change in the program. We expect the projects would still be sufficiently economically feasible that an approximately equal, holding all other variables constant, level of development would occur.
And yet that's not what the developers here tonight were telling us.
That's true.
That is true.
Commissioner Parna.
Just to follow up on that, I think if you're talking about the time frame, again, a calendar would be helpful for the projects in flight. It's just because the concerns are immediate, but the policies are long-term, right? So we want to say, hey, here's where that, not line in the sand, but this is where things roll over, right? So I think the clarity would help having these conversations. It's the same thing we asked Becky on the Overlake side for housing across the rest of the city as well. I think the concerns are real, but the concerns are today. Right? So that would really help. And the other question I had was based on some of the conversations that we had today, and this I want to talk to the commissioners about, is we have a mandated requirements for affordable housing right now, but in some of the centers we are incentivizing affordable housing. So I'm just wondering if we can provide a little bit of a carrot along these lines for developments outside of the centers, right, for affordable housing. Incentives-wise, I don't see, maybe I missed it. If If I have, please let me know which policy it is. But if there are no incentives, then maybe that could be something that we layer on, potentially. I don't know. Maybe it's too late in the game to ask for this. I don't know, but because then we say, hey, minimum we do X. If you do 2X, here's something in it for you, and that lets the market decide also in a way. So, thank you.
Commissioner Weston.
Right. I loved the technical appendix and all the information in that. I think it's just having actual numbers is fantastic. I had a few questions about little pieces that jumped out at me. The first is just a comment about the housing units by number of bedrooms for ownership properties versus rentals. It is just, families need more options with more bedrooms. And if the only new housing that's coming in is a rental, and almost all of that housing is in the 2 bedrooms or less, that's just really hard for families to make work. So that's an area where I really want to make sure that Redmond is trying to, I get that our hands are tied and this is very complicated, but that statistic just really is glaring to me. Another question that I had is, and this one's actually a question. So it said that 48 units in Redmond lack plumbing facilities. And I just don't understand how that can be a housing unit if it doesn't have plumbing.
It may have had plumbing, but then it fell into disrepair.
Interesting. Okay, and that's allowed?
Yes.
Okay.
I will follow up and see like what building codes we have to say about that, but yeah.
Okay, interesting. Another, in that same little block of amazing statistics, so the no telephone service available seems like an odd thing to be tracking now, but I would be very concerned if internet isn't available. Like, I think that's a bigger issue today, especially because, so for example, I live in a house that doesn't actually have a phone line and can't. They aren't repairing the switches at the street anymore. Our switch broke sometime before we moved in 2007, and it's just not worth it to any company to come repair it. So our only option for a phone line is through the internet or a mobile phone, and I think my understanding is that's not uncommon. But not having internet is a huge equity issue and safety issue. So that was another thing. And then the last piece that I just, you can kind of glean it from other places in this report, but I would love to see Redmond actually tracking is what percentage of homes, we have what percentage of homes were built during different years, but not the proportion of rental versus ownership in those years. And I think that that's really helpful. Like if everything that we're building now feels like a rental, like it's just really useful to have data that captures that. Sorry, and then I had one final thing. There's a line in here about housing types where they list out boats, RVs, and vans, et cetera, as having 0 units in Redmond, and that one seems odd to me because I do know that there is a population of people who live in their cars, not by choice, but they are. And so this seems to imply that that's not a thing that happens in Redmond, and I don't think that's probably true.
That was taken from census data, so it's entirely possible that the sampling just missed it.
Maybe we could add an asterisk. Thanks.
Commissioner Aparna.
Thank you, Chair. So, Ian, I had a question. In the amendment, table 21.04.03A, it has a slightly different set of zoning thingies on the headers as opposed to the LU 22 that we just discussed, 22, yeah. What I'm getting at is in terms of the, RA1, RA5, all of that, and we have NDD as well, so it's referencing the old zoning would that be updated, or would that be updated after this approval and later after LU is finished?
I can update that as it moves forward to be in harmony, but right now some of the names are in flux. So we're
Okay.
just, but yeah, there will be harmony there.
Okay, because we won't have the neighborhood district and stuff like that, commercial stuff there, so,
Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Similarly, in some of the neighborhood plans, there are references to single-family urban zones. So, Commissioner Nueva Camina.
And circling back to the topic around incentives that Commissioner Parna had brought up, where can we find a list of current incentives? So we can track, like we'll know, like, okay, well, this is the incentive that we have for this, and this is, so we're keeping tabs, or keeping in mind the incentives that already exist, and then the ones that we want to offer or that we're considering offering.
I can make a summary list of what's already existing and what's currently proposed in all of these pieces.
Yeah, and it's an interesting situation that we find ourselves in Redmond, because we're approximately, and is this accurate? We're approximately 50% renters. Okay.
Commissioner Parna.
I know I brought this up the last time around, but quite a few of you are new. Any appetite on short-term rentals and related issues to kind of figure out? It's not here. I brought it up and I don't know where it went to a watery death last time, I think. But I am persistent. So I'm just wondering if we want to really talk about the idea that short-term rentals can reduce our housing significantly for people who actually need it. We don't have any requirements right now, so.
There are some requirements around short-term
There are?
rentals.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is that it is extraordinarily difficult. It's basically impossible to enforce. We would have to send staff out, knock on every Airbnb and just be like, knock that off, please. That was, my understanding is that that's one of the reasons why further code about this topic was not proposed
Okay.
2 years ago.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Nueva Camina.
And when we're talking about short-term rentals, of course, I live downtown, and there's a lot of units that will participate in corporate housing.
Mm-hmm.
So are those one and the same when we're talking about code?
I don't think so, but I would need to review the code specifically to make sure.
Often our residents, if they've got an ADU, then they'll do a short-term rental for folks that are coming in.
Yeah.
They're in transition while they're getting settled with the new job. And then where's the separation between that? Because I'm foggy with that.
I'll research and get that to you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Van Nyman.
Okay, so I would like a parking subsidy, parking allocation lesson for dummies. Not right now. I wanted, that's one of the things I want to circle back to down the line is, I know we've talked about it before, and you guys apparently have done a ton of work on it, and there's a ton of trade-offs and different, you said there are mutually exclusive goals from different groups, and I'd like to really understand what that looks like, because I still can't really understand all of the ramifications of each of these options. Like when you said that FutureWise said if we didn't offer it to everybody, it would incentivize car ownership. And I'm still sitting here trying to figure out how that works, because it's a hard topic to get your head around. So I'd like a briefing on that.
Perhaps some history around how we came to this topic. Because this came to us before, this came from some recommendations from Arch, and City Council acted on it. So.
Don't forget the for dummies part.
Related to that, is there any consideration to the suggestion that we look at a parking credit rather than a parking allowance?
That was one of the pieces that was proposed and considered, yeah.
Okay.
And we'll include that in the briefing.
Commissioner Aparna.
Just one question. In the neighborhood plans on housing, we've got multiplex stated in every neighborhood plan. Is that something we need to do, or if we say, oh, citywide, we're going to be doing this, does it have to appear in every neighborhood plan?
If we have a policy citywide promoting it,
right,
then we would not need to identify it in the neighborhood plan. Typically, what we see there is limitations on things that were promoted citywide.
Ah, okay. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
And remember, the comp plan has to be consistent with itself at all times, so we're in this transition phase. Anything else on housing for tonight? Okay. Thank you, Ian. And we're going to see how much we can get into the next topic before we turn into pumpkins. We're going to go into Redmond 2050 Overlake Zone Regulations Study Session. Becky.
Yes, let me share my screen here. All right, due to the just enormous amount of technical data that you received in this packet, and the time that it's taking, what we're only doing today is just introducing the package and what is in it and what are the major changes. So there are about 30 slides in here, but Kim and I are just really trying to highlight, so we're not going to necessarily talk through each of them to, again, try to get you out of here before 10. But we're open to questions, and we'll be here as long as you choose to be here. But we are looking at Redmond 2050 components. And everything that is changing throughout the code that is related to implementing the overlake changes, and all of the Redmond zoning code rewrite pieces that are either in some way related to what we're doing in overlake, or they happen to be in the same chapter, and it makes sense to just fold everybody's in the same edit. And so those are the pieces that you see here. We shared this a couple months ago. It has been slightly updated since then. And so I think Kim is not feeling well today, and so I'll just introduce her pieces, and then we'll go through Overlake. And again, we are going to be having conversations about this code package in depth for the next 4 meetings. So again, just for tonight, we're just going to try to introduce the topics and get them a little bit more familiar in your mind, and then we can start going into a deeper dive. And we've actually spread out the topics in chunks, and before we close out today, I'll talk to you about how we're moving those forward. So from the zoning code rewrite perspective, we're including updates to 2104 related to limited uses, a new code section on 2122 for public arts, the green building incentive program updates in 2167, as well as a brand new appendix 10 about the program itself, a brand new section on solid waste management, some definitions that are coming out of the zoning code rewrite, and what we have taken from parking and moving forward into Overlake, those pieces related to transportation that are Overlake parking. So all of those pieces are moving forward with this package. With limited uses, we spoke a couple of months ago about some changes that we're looking to do to make it more clear and more consistent where we use an L for limited or a C for conditional, and then exactly when a limited would be clarified, and the different cases. So we're actually calling out that these 4 things you see on the slide, in those 4 cases, we will use limited. And then that we'll actually have the special regulations around the limitations. And it'll occur either in the special regulations or the notes. So we're working through some of that details. As I mentioned a couple of months ago when we first brought this concept up, this is going to take a lot of editing, and it will not be resolved completely with this package. It'll be something that we'll just be cleaning up as we go, probably through the annual code cleanup or other phases of Redmond 2050 packaging for the next couple of years until we actually get it cleaned up, because we do recognize that this section of code was built over how many decades, and it just was not 100% consistent within and of itself. So we're going to work on that, but just acknowledge the fact that this was going to take some time to get it completely done. And then for the public art code, this is just codifying what we already do from a process for public art. Just adopting the definitions and review processes and just clarifying the authority. And then, so just the pieces and parts of how we do public art and just getting those into code. For the Green Building Incentive Program, Jenny is redoing the program. We're matching it from a structural standpoint to what we're doing in Overlake. It's going to be a point-based system. It's going to be based on outcomes that we desire. And the more you do, obviously, the better you get in return. And so there's a lot of those things that are going to be in parallel. But the work she's really focused on is making sure that she's implementing a lot of the specific pieces in the Environmental Sustainability Action Plan, and just clarifying the structure itself. So that's what Appendix 10 will be. It is a brand new appendix, like I mentioned, and it lays out the program, the Green Building Program, not the incentives, but the Green Building Program itself. We are creating a new chapter for solid waste management. This is an issue that the city staff has been working on for a number of years, trying to address as we become more and more urban in our development patterns, where trash will go while it is being waiting for pickup and how it interacts with our streets and our sidewalks and just all of those things needs to be clarified. And so this new chapter will address that, including spacing and overflows, just modernizing the code in and of itself and providing some design guidance. And there is some recent state law related to marijuana versus cannabis and family daycares. So that's going to be rolled up with the definition update. And as I mentioned, the parking regulation updates that are moving forward are only the ones that are going to be related to Overlake. For right now, they will still live in 2112. And so what we did is we edited the existing section related to parking and put in the new standards. But when next year the parking regulations citywide go in place, they will be struck from 2112, and all of the parking will be all in one spot. So it's a little awkward right now, and we may change our mind on how that works. But for right now, in the review documents you have, it's just in 2112 in the old section, just updated. So for Overlake, we obviously have 2112, which is the bulk of where the Overlake regulations exist, but we have a whole bunch of other pieces and parts that need to be touched to implement what we're doing in Overlake. for a number of different reasons. Maybe it's a naming convention, maybe it's we've got new zoning districts that we got to address, or the zoning consolidation. There's a lot of different things that we're doing that are going to be impacting this. So I'm going to walk you through, again, at a very, very high level. We're trying to get you out of here quickly, what the intended purposes for these sections are. But stop me if you've got any questions. I'd be happy to go through that. So to create our new transit-oriented development focus areas and our new intercultural district, we debated whether or not they should live in Overlake or be in a citywide district chapter. We're proposing a new chapter, 2104. It'll come immediately after 2105 comes immediately after 2104, where we establish our zoning districts. And this will establish a special district section of code so that if we want to do a TOD focus area in Marymore or downtown, or maybe a line, the rapid line, the B line, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the centers or related to the light rail stations. So if we want to implement a transit-oriented development focus area in our city in some place, we have a space for that. And then there's a lot of conversations we've been having with Philly Marsh and our economic development conversations about districts, business districts, cultural districts, and whatnot. So we are moving that intercultural district out of 2112 as well and putting it in as a special district, so that if there are any other cultural districts or business districts that need to be created, they can actually have a place to be established in code. So that will be we're proposing 2105. As a reminder, I mentioned last meeting that we removed these maps from the comp plan intentionally, so that if we want to make edits, we can do that with a code update and not require an annual docket process to make an update to these special districts boundaries. And so that is one of the things that has changed also. We are repealing 2128 while we were working on and preparing for light rail. We needed to make sure that we weren't developing in the areas where the light rail was intended to go through. That was the sole intention of this section, is just to make sure that we didn't cannonball our light rail plans. And so now that we're under construction and almost open, we don't need the section at all. And so we're just going to repeal it. 2148 is our Transfer of Development Rights program. We know the TDR program needs to be updated. And one of the things we debated is the scope of Redmond 2050 is, do we update this now or do we update it later? Based on just the sheer quantity of things that are moving forward and what absolutely has to move forward and what are high priority items, the update to the Transfer of Development Right program will wait. It will not be done with Redmond 2050. However, we did want to make sure that there were some minor updates to reflect the new Overlake multifamily zones. Again, when we adopt completely new zoning districts next year, we might actually take a look at this chart and have to redo the chart itself because we'll have new zoning districts. So, but for right now, we just wanted to make sure that the new Overlake multifamily zone was in the TDR program. Transition overlay areas. If you recall, a couple months ago, I brought this to you. Right now, we have this section of code in 2150 that says if you were in a higher density or higher intensity district and you're immediately adjacent to one of the specifically called out lower density or single family districts, whether you're in Bellevue or in Redmond, that you would have a supplemental setback. And the setback would be either 150 feet or 300 feet. That is in direct conflict with our desire to move away from campus-style development and towards transit-oriented development in the Overlake Business and Advanced Technology Zoning District, the OBAT zoning district. So what we are proposing is to eliminate that requirement in the transition overlay areas. However, we also got a lot of comments about still needing to maintain some kind of a transition And so we're going to be noting instead that there will be a height limit in those areas as the transition instead of a setback, so that we can actually get the TOD, but on the street level, you're not going to get like a 12-story building right across maybe the street from a lower density residential development. So that's what we're working on in 2150. In 2158, it's literally just renaming the section that we're calling 2162, which is where the overlake work is. In 2160, and this is a change to when we went out to test the draft design standards, we had the high-rise, the tower development standards actually in 2162 with overlake. It was recommended that we move that out of overlake because at some point, and it could be decades from now, but at some point we may want to allow those in different areas of the city. And so why not just establish them in the citywide section of code and then just leave them there? And then obviously for right now, only will be applicable in overlake, but then we wouldn't have to make any adjustments later on. And then in 2162, in the urban center standards, we are renaming the Overlake Village application to Overlake Metro Center. So right now we have design standards that are only applicable in the OV 1 through 5. And they are related to transit-oriented development, pedestrian orientation, building form and scale and massing. And so all of those things really are related to what we want to see in all of the TOD focus areas and really as a part of the urban standards for the Metro Center. And so we are changing that to be applicable to the entire Metro Center. So that is one change. There's a lot of naming conventions and cross-references that are being updated. And obviously, we're looking at parking garage and building form and scale and some things. There are citywide updates to design standards that we're working on with the zoning code rewrite phase 3, which hasn't gone out to the public yet because we're still working internally on it. And so one of the things that may end up happening is we may be streamlining this a little bit more when that gets through the entire process. But for right now, we wanted to make sure that the urban standards for the urban forms that we're adopting with Overlake are updated and current instead of waiting for the other work to be done. So there's some updates happening there. And then we have definitions that we're adopting for centers and transit-oriented development, affordable commercial. We also are rolling up different group housing types into this new congregate housing category. It's a roll-up category to make the use chart a little bit easier. And so we're adopting a definition for congregate housing. So just making sure that the terms that we use are actually in our definitions. So, the big thing to keep in mind too, though, is 2112, right? So we got this whole bit and pieces that's moving forward. There are a couple of weird things right now, not just parking, which I mentioned, but the landscaping and open space consolidation into one section of code isn't going to move forward until next year as well. And so the landscaping and open space requirements for Overlake are currently staying in 2112. Again, that will get struck from 2112 when the citywide standards get adopted next year. All the other sections in 2112 that exist today are going to be repealed and replaced. So that is approximately 140 pages of strike-throughs. Breathe. It's a lot, but what we're doing is we're making the new section of code a lot easier, a lot shorter, a lot more streamlined, easier to understand, easier to read. So rather than doing a whole series of strike-throughs that just became really super complicated, it was easier for us to do a complete repeal and replace from an understanding standpoint.
Right.
So the new sections will look like this, not including the parking, landscaping, and open space, right? Because those are eventually going to move out. This was going to be what the new sections look like. It's still 2112, but we're starting with new numbers because we're repealing and just wiping out everything that's coming before. The zoning districts are going to be established in 300. We're not going to have a separate section for each zoning district. And we've seen how we're just doing a table, and then just all the zoning districts are in one table. We're updating the references. That's pretty straightforward. We do have some updates that were proposed to the master planning section. One, to make it not just to kind of decouple it from the development agreement process, but also we have a requirement to show that we can accommodate our growth. And so there is some proposed language in the master planning section, and you heard some comments from some folks earlier today that we will need to look at as how do we balance the need to make sure that we can accommodate growth with the fact that today those high-rise developments don't market out. So we have to figure out a solution. We have a starting point in the packet, and we're going to have additional conversations on that with our developers.
Becky, I'm going to interrupt you. Becky, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. We're coming up on 10 o'clock, so I'm going to ask the commission if someone can make a motion to extend our meeting for an extra 15 minutes past our deadline.
So moved.
A second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thanks. Okay, Becky.
Thank you. Again, I'm going to do this as fast as I can. So in 400, we have our land use charts. So residential will be in 410 and non-residential in 420. Again, we're consolidating them all. We're not going to have separate use charts for each zoning district. It will be one use chart for residential, one for non-residential, and each zoning district will be its own column. Again, that's another attempt to just streamline and make it easier for people to compare. The development standards, the height and FAR and those types of things are going to be found in 500. All of the street-related topologies that we've been talking about are in 510. In this packet, you've seen the maps, but there are tables that go with the maps that will be in your next packet, hopefully, with some additional information. And then the incentive program will be in 600. And again, that's not in your packet this time because we're still working through some of the data. I am going to skip like the specific details, but it is in what we sent out. I do want to just really quickly talk about how we're packaging this for the public hearings. We're taking it into 3 chunks, and we're sending the public hearing notice to the paper this week, and we'll be advertising it this way so that folks who are interested in a specific thing don't have to necessarily come to the 9th if we're not talking about it till the 30th. We're going to start with a lot of the zoning code rewrite pieces that are just really straightforward: the public art and solid waste, the special districts high capacity transit corridor repeal, the minor edit to transit-oriented development, the minor edit to the transition overlays areas, and we'll start looking at the definitions as well. So this is what we'll start with. We're hoping that by getting these smaller edits done first, you can give you a couple of extra weeks to read through the more weighty things. And then on the 23rd, we'll start to dive into those where folks have had a lot of comments. We'll actually be starting 2112. We won't finish all of it. We'll be looking at the design standards as well in 58, 60, and 62. And then on the 30th, we're going to be looking at the green building program and the incentive program and whatever's left of 2112, and then whatever we need to look for at in 2104. So this is our plan to try to chunk it up and allow you to look at some of the easy things and give you a little bit more time to read through the more complicated ones. The other thing that we're doing to help with this is the tech report and tech recommendations will come out in 3 parts and will go with these chunks so that you'll see the tech recommendations with these pieces in the same way. That way you don't necessarily have to do 3 recommendations at the end, but you'll have the tech recommendations for that section when you're looking at it. And again, I can help answer any questions. Kim and I are always happy to talk. We do have a couple other things we did want to point out. We've had some questions about the affordable housing changes that we're doing in Overlake. I just wanted to mention that we are also dramatically increasing what you can get to do in Overlake. And so the bonus units that you can actually add will be more than the required units for the affordable housing. So we're hoping that that is part of the balancing act. We have a lot of additional pieces and parts that are going to be shared from the incentive program at your next meeting, and we'll have a really, really in-depth look at a number of different pieces and parts moving forward. I did also want to mention, for anybody who's following along, we do have a workshop scheduled on the Overlake Code that will touch on the incentive program and all the other pieces next week on the 20th. And so that will be at City Hall, but there is an online a way to walk into that meeting. So that is where I'm going to leave you tonight. Really super fast, but still long because it's a long package. But hopefully the way that we're proposing to bring it to you in chunks will help you give time to, and you can focus your attention on the easy things first while letting yourself absorb the more complicated ones.
Great. I appreciate that walkthrough, Becky. Any questions for Becky before we let her go? No questions. Thanks a lot, Becky.
Okay, we'll be back many, many times.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, staff and commissioner updates. Ian, what do you got for us?
One of the big takeaways is that workshop on the 20th. We can get you the specific logistics of how you could participate. Other than that, we do have the 3 meetings coming up. The 26th, probably going to be 3 hours. August 9th, there's 2 public hearings on that one, housing and the first of the Overlake, probably going to be 3 hours. And the one after that, you guessed it, probably 3 hours, and that will have the second public hearing of the Overlake. So that is the 23rd. And staff across City Hall would just like to emphasize how grateful we are for you volunteers taking time out of your busy lives to contribute to our community. So thank you all.
Yeah. Happy summer, everybody. Okay, any commissioner updates? Commissioner Weston.
Just wanted to mention that many of us will be at Derby Days, participating in booths and parades and all sorts of things. So to hopefully get community input.
Okay. With that, I look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And we are adjourned.